Good morning. I appreciate everyone tuning in. I want to thank Mike Cherry and David Hewitt for inviting me to talk this morning on some of the research that we've done looking at the effect of grazing on the abundance of forbs that are palatable to white-tailed deer. Now, before I start talking about this research, I want to acknowledge my co-authors who contributed substantially to this work. These include Poncho Ortega, Stacy Hines, Dylan Drabick, Ramon Saenz, Dave Hewitt, David Wester, and Tyler Campbell, plus a host of undergraduate students that helped us out greatly. Well, during my 39 years in South Texas, there were a number of occasions where I drove into a pasture with a ranch manager, and the remark was made that this pasture needs some grazing. And the idea behind that remark is that grasses were so abundant that they were choking out forbs, and to increase the abundance of forbs for wildlife, some degree of grazing by cattle was needed to reduce the amount of grass and give the forbs an advantage, enable them to increase. And so the objective of the research that I'm going to be talking about today, it was to determine the relationship between grazing intensity and forb abundance in South Texas. Ecologists have thought about this relationship on a broader scale. And one of the ideas that you find in the ecological literature is that the abundance of forbs should increase with the intensity of grazing in a curvilinear fashion. And what that means is that if you have no grazing or a very light level of grazing, grasses are real abundant and they competitively exclude forbs. But since cattle prefer grasses over other classes of forage, as grazing intensity increases, the grasses should decline, giving a competitive advantage to forbs. And so they should increase with increasing intensity of grasses up to some moderate level. Now, beyond that, as grazing intensity continues to increase, the grasses decline in abundance, and therefore the cows start eating forbs. And so the forbs also decline in abundance. But there should be some theoretical optimal level of grazing that increases forbs. And so this is the idea that we decided to test in South Texas. And to test this idea, we did the research on the East Foundation properties, 4 of their ranches, the San Antonio Viejo, Buena Vista, Santa Rosa, and East El Saus. The San Antonio Viejo is the largest of the 4 ranches, and we had 3 study sites on San Antonio Viejo. These are detected by, or indicated on the map by these crosshatched circles. And you can see that on the San Antonio Viejo, we had a study site on the north side of the ranch, then sort of in the middle of the ranch, and then on the south side. And for each of the other 3 ranches, we had 1 study site per ranch. Now, I want to express my gratitude and thanks to the East Foundation for supporting this study. They provided the primary funding for the research, as well as the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. The East Foundation is an agricultural research organization that promotes conservation of wildlife on working cattle ranches through an integrated program of ranching science and education. Not only did they fund this research, but they provided a lot of necessary infrastructure, logistical support, and just general support for our students and researchers. Just a great organization to work with, and deeply appreciate our relationship with them. So to determine the effect of grazing on forbs, on each of these study sites that I showed you in the previous map, we established 50 grazing exclosures. And one of those is shown in this photograph. And paired with each of the grazing exclosures was a grazed site. And so we could look at ungrazed and grazed areas. And so we had 50 of these pairs on each site and 6 different sites. So 300 pairs of grazing exclosures and grazed plots in each study site. Beginning in autumn of 2012 and through autumn of 2019, we clipped vegetation in these grazing exclosures and the nearby grazed plot. And after clipping each time, we moved the grazing exclosure to a new location for the next year's sampling. The vegetation that we clipped inside the plots was separated into grasses, selected forbs or forbs that are palatable to white-tailed deer. And we identified 82 different species that we felt were palatable to white-tailed deer based on previous research on deer food habits. And then we had 32 other species of forbs that weren't so palatable based on the literature. These included species like silver sunflower, which is a very robust sunflower that grows on the sandy soils in that area. Deer just don't seem to like to eat silver sunflower very much. To estimate the percent use of grasses, we took the grass standing crop in the exclosures and outside the exclosures to estimate percent use. And percent use of grasses was our metric of grazing intensity. As the percent use of grasses increased, then we assumed that that was a reflection of increasing intensity of grazing. And then we did a bunch of statistics with the data, which Dr. Wester and I found fascinating. Most people, not so much. So as you would expect in South Texas, we had a lot of variation in rainfall from year to year. And many of you remember 2011, which was a record drought year. And we started our study in 2012, the year after the record drought year. 2012 was pretty much of a drought year as well. 2015 was our wet year. And if you're a quail hunter, I'm sure you'll remember 2015 because quail were really abundant in South Texas. But a lot of variation in rainfall and consequently, a lot of variation in the standing crop of grasses and the standing crop of selected forbs. As I talked about in previous slides, what you expect to see is that when you have a lot of grasses, you have fewer forbs. And the lines here with selected forbs and grasses don't exactly parallel. So it starts you to think, well, did we have this relationship? And in fact, what we found was that when we looked at the percentage use of grasses on the x-axis in this slide and the standing crop of forbs, selected forbs, or the palatable ones to deer on the y-axis, there was no statistical relationship. In other words, selected forbs neither increased nor decreased with increasing intensity of grazing. And the same was true when we pooled all the forbs. Now, if we averaged the pounds per acre of selected forbs in the exclosures across years and across study sites, and the pounds per acre of selected forbs in the grazed plots, grazing tended to reduce the overall abundance or standing crop of selected forbs. But understand the standing crop of selected forbs didn't increase or decrease with intensity. It was just an overall effect, irregardless of grazing intensity. So what did influence the abundance of forbs? And there were two things that we found that greatly influenced the abundance of forbs, far more than did grazing. And that was rainfall and soil texture. On the rainfall, we ran a bunch of different models with individual months rainfall, with combinations of months of rainfall. And what shook out in the models was that what influenced the standing crop of selected forbs the most was September rainfall. And that was true of all forbs combined as well. So rainfall in September was the strongest thing that influenced the abundance, or the strongest rainfall measure that influenced the abundance of forbs in October and November when we did the clipping. Soil texture was another thing that strongly influenced forb abundance. And there was an interaction of rainfall and the percent sand in the soil in influencing the standing crop of selected forbs in pounds per acre. So, we found no influence of cattle grazing on either selected forbs or all forbs put together. And, cows have a pretty big impact out there on the range. And so that was a little hard for us to swallow. And we started thinking, what are we missing here? There's got to be something that we're not thinking about in trying to interpret this data. And one thing that occurred to us was the heterogeneous nature of the landscape on these rangelands in South Texas. And there are some areas that are basically devoid of vegetation or have very sparse vegetation. And then there are other patches that have a whole lot of grass. And so generally on these rangelands, you have a mixture of patches that don't have much vegetation and then patches that have a lot of vegetation. And this is driven by things like soils. And so if you think about an animal grazing on this landscape, are they going to spend a lot of time in a patch where there's no vegetation? Probably not. And so these areas with less vegetation probably represent areas that aren't grazed much. But we randomly placed all these grazing exclosures, and so they could have fallen on a relatively bare patch as well as on a very productive patch. So is it possible that we were doing a lot of sampling of vegetation in areas that cows really weren't grazing too much? So we decided to look at that. And what we did, we looked at what the average residual standing crop of grass was in the grazed plots. And after grazing, on average, across years and across study sites, there was about 560 pounds per acre of grass remaining in the fall after almost a year of grazing. And so we decided to take that number, which 560 pounds per acre is not a lot of grass, and for all of the exclosures, the protected plots that weren't grazed, if a protected plot had less than 560 pounds per acre of grass in it, we just excluded that from the data set, as well as the grazed plots. So all the pairs of grazed and ungrazed plots that we had, where the ungrazed plot had less than 560 pounds per acre, we threw out of the data set. And that turned out to be over half of our data set. So basically half the landscape, because we were randomly sampling, had under 560 pounds per acre. And so we assumed that cattle probably didn't spend a lot of time grazing in those portions of the landscape, and they spent most of their time in plots that had more than 560 pounds per acre. And so those were the ones where we had greater than 560 pounds per acre in the exclosures that we left in the data set. And then we ran our analyses again. And what did we find? Well, again, for selected forbs, for the most palatable forbs, there was no relationship of grazing intensity with the standing crop of palatable forbs. But when we lumped all the forbs together, we did find some relationships, and they were pretty complicated relationships. There was an interaction of percent use of grasses or grazing intensity and rainfall and soil texture, or percent sand in the soil. And so to try to understand the nature of that interaction, we ran a number of different scenarios varying the amount of rainfall and the amount of sand in the soil. And so, for example, in this graph, we took the average amount of rainfall in September, and percent use is on the x-axis, and the standing crop of total forbs is on the y-axis, and we varied the amount of sand. And what we found was that at low to moderate amounts of sand, the total amount of forbs tended to decline as grazing intensity increased. But on the really sandy soils, we found a curvilinear response similar to that hypothetical graph that I showed you earlier, where as grazing intensity increased, total forbs tended to increase up to intermediate level or intermediate intensity of grazing, and then thereafter they declined. And that's depicted by the green line, the top line in the graph. And so then the next thing that we did was we held the amount of sand constant, and we varied the amount of rainfall. And so we had a 2-inch September rainfall scenario, which is, not a real wet September. But then we had another very wet September rainfall with 8 inches of September rainfall. And that is depicted by, again, the green line in the top of the graph. And so what we found was that if you have an average to below average rainfall year, the total amount of forbs tends to decline as grazing intensity increases. But if you have a really wet September, then the total amount of forbs increases with intensity of grazing use up to around 50% use, which is a moderate level of use, and most people consider it that. And then afterwards, the standing crop of total forbs declined. And so we had this interaction of the rainfall, soils, and percent use. And percent use only or increasing intensity of grazing only cause forbs to increase in these very sandy soils and in wet years. So what does all this stuff mean? Well, for the most palatable forbs, essentially intensity of grazing doesn't have an influence on their abundance based on our data. The abundance of these palatable forbs that deer like to eat is determined primarily by the amount of rainfall in September and soil texture. Now, we did find that these most palatable forbs tended to be less, irrespective of grazing intensity, on areas that were grazed. And so what we would recommend, if you want to manage for a greater abundance of these most palatable forbs, then practice light to moderate grazing. For total Forbs, the abundance of total Forbs is also largely determined by September rainfall and by the percent sand in the soil. But if you filter out and just look at the portion of the landscape that has the highest standing crop of grasses in wet years on sandy soils, a moderate intensity of grazing may increase total Forbs. But in dry years and heavier soils, grazing tends to, as grazing intensity increases, total Forbs tend to decline. Well, this is kind of an awkward thing for management because you can't predict when you're going to have a wet year. Now, the areas that we were using in our study, the study sites, had a long history of grazing. We didn't look at areas that were in excellent range condition or pristine range condition. And so maybe our results would have been somewhat different if we had had areas that didn't have a history of grazing, but those were not available. Also, if you're doing this same study in an area that has a lot higher rainfall than what South Texas does and less variable rainfall, our results could have been different. For example, there have been studies done in the tallgrass prairies of Kansas where grazing certainly causes Forbs to increase. And then another thing that we found in this study was that it does make a difference when you take into account the heterogeneity of the landscape, and when you only account for areas where animals are grazing. And that's something to think about in the future for our research, is to we have these great tools with geographic information systems and GPS collars where we can map where animals spend most of their time grazing, and maybe those are the areas that we need to be sampling. Another thing that I think is really important to mention is that these grasslands on the East Foundation properties were native grasslands. We had some buffalo grass in one of our study sites on San Antonio Viejo, but for the most part, they were native. When you have rangelands that are dominated by invasive grasses such as buffalo grass, guinea grass, or tanglehead, it's a whole different ballgame. These grasses change the functioning of ecosystems. And because these ecosystems that are invaded function differently, they need to be managed differently. And the good news is that there have been several studies that have shown that combinations of grazing and fire or grazing alone tends to cause Forbs to increase in these invaded ecosystems. And so, for example, Pancho Ortega did a study in areas dominated by guinea grass with patch burning and grazing and got a positive response of Forbs. Bart DuPont and Jimmy Rutledge were involved in a study looking at targeted grazing on buffalo grass, and they found an increase in species diversity. So in these systems that support invasive grasses, grazing as a tool to increase Forbs is a promising management practice. So that gets us to the final question here: is grazing a tool to increase Forbs? Well, where it works is in these areas that are dominated by exotic or invasive grasses that I just talked about. And so it definitely is a tool to increase Forbs in those environments. And it also may be a tool to increase Forbs in environments with higher rainfall, such as the tallgrass prairies in Kansas, as an example. But where it doesn't work so well is in these semi-arid environments like we have in South Texas, where we have really high variability in rainfall.